In this next video, I'll be interviewing Gordon Cousins, the founder and the chairman of Business Today. I've been working with Gordon for many years now, about 18 years. And one thing that I can say about him is that he's bat crazy, but in a really good way. Gordon is crazy enough to believe that we can spark that change in the rules of the game, the financial game, in order to save Mother Earth, in a way that others don't seem to be focusing on. So stay tuned.
Hi Gordon, so thank you for sharing this with us today. I could introduce you, but I've known you for far too long, so I've got far too many dirty secrets on you, so I'll allow you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, we should keep those private, yeah. Right, so my name is Gordon Cousins. I'm the founder and currently the executive chairman of the Business Today group of companies. And in Business Today, what we do is we build business games, which we use to help people to really understand their business. And we do this, the business was founded by myself in South Africa, and now it's a global business. Debbie's in the United States. We have some people in London. We have people, in fact, in 32 countries around the world, and they're all partners. And all of us, in fact, play games. And so it comes to a passionate belief about discovery learning. Concept is, and Debbie knows this better than anybody else, we absolutely believe in, if I tell you something, it's true for me. You discover it, it's true for you.
So GAIA, let's not assume that everybody knows what it means. Can you start by telling us what does it mean and what does it mean to you?
It is the Greek term, which in fact is the Greek for Earth or for Mother Earth.
Yeah.
And really the concept of Gaia was that the Greeks realized, in fact, that actually if you don't respect and guard and protect Mother Earth, well then we will all be liquidated anyway, so it doesn't matter. So therefore the concept of Mother Earth as a body, as a person, as the mother of all of us, and therefore something that should be respected and should be treated with respect, really is what the concept is about. My personal mission is to make a difference. And the reason we do the finance stuff we do, because I think if people could understand the impact of what we do in a financial context back on the earth and realize that if in fact we do things that effectively rape the earth, well then we're not effectively developing long-term business sustainability. We're not developing long-term sustainability for anything. So actually, anything we do from a business point of view, which doesn't in fact protect and develop the earth itself, is actually counterproductive from a financial point of view.
Okay, well, today's topic, as we've got there on the screen, is why aren't corporates with lots of cash investing more in saving the planet? Now, we know they are investing. There is quite a lot of investment going on, but there is plenty still to go around. So let's take Microsoft, as you've got up there on screen. Let's take Microsoft as an example.
At the current balance sheet, at the June 2020 balance sheet, Microsoft had cash and cash equivalents, $136 billion. Now, I'm not picking on Microsoft, because if you looked at Apple, if you looked at Alphabet, if you looked at any of the IT companies and many other companies, you'd see many companies have got lots of cash. And if you think about it from a Microsoft point of view, what we'd have to say is, all right, they've got $136 billion in cash, but that's like the water in a dam. Now, the point is, you can't drink down all the water in the dam, because then you end up with a drought and we end up dying anyway of thirst. So you've got to make sure how much water is flowing into the dam. So yeah, Microsoft's dam of cash is 136 billion. Now, what flows in? Let's look at the 2020 years. So if we have to look at Microsoft's cash flow really has got three parts: cash flow from operating activities, cash flow from investing activities, and cash flow from financing activities. So Microsoft, now its cash flow from operating activities, generated $18 billion positive cash flow from operating activities. And the operating activities is really the profit that it makes out of its business trading, plus the way it's managing its working capital. Those are the two components of cash flow from operating activities. Now, then the cash flow from investing activities, which is fixed assets and all that sort of stuff, it's always a negative. Microsoft in the 2020 year invested $4.6 billion in assets, if you like, largely fixed assets. Cash flow from investing activities a negative, which meant, in short terms, free cash flow, and it's a short abbreviation of free cash flow. Some people have got slightly different calculations attached to it, but basically Microsoft had free cash flow of $14 billion from the 2020 year. Now, of course, that's not all cash that they can put into their dam, because they've got to do something with that. And one of the things they've got to do with that, they've got to service their shareholders. So in 2020, Microsoft paid $3.9 billion to its shareholders. So out of the $14 billion it had available, it paid $3.9 billion to the shareholders. Interestingly enough, Microsoft also took $5.8 billion and did some share buybacks, which is a really interesting point, which is not the purpose of today. So if you look at that, effectively, Microsoft is still got a positive flow from the stream that's feeding its dam. Now, the dam is much bigger than the flow that came in from the stream this year. In prior years, Microsoft built up more cash into the stream. But if we look at that situation, that means Microsoft ends up with more money in the dam at the end of this year than they did at the end of last year. So that's the sort of Microsoft situation, Debs. And that's the current. Do Microsoft have lots of money? Absolutely. Are they investing? Sure, Microsoft in itself has got a really good sustainability attitude, and it does drive sustainability projects, but the level of the investment is not billions and billions of dollars.
Let's come back to our original question. So if they're sitting on so much cash at the moment, why aren't they investing more in saving the planet?
No, it's a great question, and really it's not Microsoft's fault. It's about the accounting rules. So what happens in accounting in a company is, running a business is all about expenditure. Of course, it's income and expenditure, but taking the expenditure part. Whenever you spend some money in a business, you have to do one of two things. The finance team has to decide, is that expenditure an expense? In which case, they charge it to the income statement or P&L, or can they capitalize it and treat it as an asset? Now, the interesting thing is if it gets treated as an expense, then clearly what it does, it reduces the profit. And so that expense will reduce the bottom line and therefore reduce the net profit. We'll come back to the asset piece a little bit later. The interesting thing is if you then think about, well, let's talk about this from a market point of view, from the stock price point of view. Because remember, the CEO of Microsoft, his job, and the job of the top team, is to maximize shareholder value. Now, shareholder value is effectively represented by the market price of the share. And all the people with their 401ks that are holding Microsoft shares in their 401ks, well, clearly, Microsoft performance affects people's assets right across the country. So it's not just a few rich shareholders, it's everybody that's interested in Microsoft's share price. So what would happen? Share price firstly is calculated by taking, the earnings per share, and that is multiplied by something which is called a price earnings multiple. We're going to go into more detail about the price earnings multiple later, but not on this program. So therefore, if we had to look at the situation, how do we calculate earnings per share? Well, we calculate earnings per share by taking the net profit or net income from the year's income statement, and we divide it by the number of shares in issue. So what do those numbers look like in terms of, and the price earnings multiple is simply an inverse of the other one. I'll come back to that one. So let's have a look at those numbers from a Microsoft point of view. And what you'll notice, if you had to look at the Microsoft accounts this particular year, is that Microsoft has an earnings per share in the latest financial year of $5.76. And Microsoft has a price earnings ratio as of yesterday on the NASDAQ of 36.33. That's the multiple by which the earnings per share multiplied to arrive at a market price, which it was yesterday on NASDAQ, of $208 to $209 a share. So that's the dynamics, that's the numbers for Microsoft. So that's kind of the Microsoft situation. That's earnings per share is calculated by looking at the profit, and Microsoft made an amazing, very successful, super well-run business, $41 billion of profit, $44 billion of profit on a number of shares of 7.6 billion shares in issue. Divide the one by the other, and you'll end up with the earnings per share. So those are the key numbers for Microsoft. So now the important thing is, and so what? So what's wrong with that? So it's a great business. It's well run. It's growing. It's developing. It's putting cash in the bank. Fantastic business.
Okay, so now what happens if they decide that they're going to take some of that net profit and instead of paying it out to the various places as you've described, they're going to now invest it into some of these GAIA projects?
Well, let's just rephrase that. Let's say they said, we want to take some of our cash. Remember, they've got $134 billion burning a hole in their pocket in cash. And let's say they wanted to take some of our cash and invest it in a GAIA project. So you can just go back one screen and I'll show you. So they're going to invest the money. Now, the problem is, can they put it as an asset? No. Now, why not? Well, because briefly, the definition of an asset, we'll come to this later on, but the definition of an asset is something of value owned by the business. Now, if Microsoft decided they were going to give $23 billion to the Doomsday Glacier project, and I don't know if you know about that, Des, but the Doomsday Glacier is the big glacier in the Antarctic, which at the present moment in time, if it melted, there's enough water in that to fill the Grand Canyon. So if Microsoft said, that's a worthy project, let's get involved in that. Let's take 23 billion of 134 billion and invest it in the glacier. Now, could they capitalize it? No. They don't own the glacier. It's not an asset. It's not their asset. And so a definition of an asset is something of value owned by the business which they intend to keep. So they couldn't capitalize. So they would have to, coming down the left-hand side, they would have to expense it. If they actually invested 23 billion in saving the glacier, well, what would happen? So the earnings per share, which is what we talked about earlier on, the profit, in fact, would drop from the 45 billion odd. The profit would drop down to 20 by the 23 billion. So the profit would drop to something like about 21 billion. Yeah. Now, the number of shares in issue would stay the same, and therefore the earnings per share would effectively drop down to $2.75. Now with the earnings per share $2.75, if the price earnings multiple had to stay the same, and that's a big if, by the way, then the market price would drop to $100 a share. So all of a sudden, which was trading at $208, and in everyone's 401k, and in all the institutional portfolios, Microsoft at $208. Suddenly, Microsoft does the right thing by taking some of its money that it's sitting on and actually started investing in one of the many ways to save the planet. Well, what would happen is if they did that, they would halve the share price. Now, if Microsoft's share price dropped by half, you can imagine what would happen.
Go
the
down a ton of bricks.
NASDAQ index would plummet, all of the shares would plummet. There would be a major, major panic, and what it would probably do is wipe out trillions and trillions of value. If Microsoft did the right thing, because of the way they're obliged to account, this is not them trying to be greedy, because of the way they're obliged to account through IFRS or US GAAP rules, they would lose half their value. Crazy. No executive in their right mind would go ahead, invest in the 9 planetary boundaries or something like that, and halve their share price. They wouldn't do it.
So what are the other options? We've spoken about investing it and capitalizing it as an asset. So let's talk about the perfect world.
But I can't capitalize it because when you start to look at the IFRS rules, and one needs to understand all of these rules, and the US GAAP rules are all the same. Well, what they would try to do is they've tried to stop people fiddling in the balance sheet with expenses and things. And the reason they started to do that, unfortunately, was courtesy of Mr. Skilling and Enron. Now, Enron happened in the year 2000. And as many people remember, what Enron was doing was constructing many joint venture arrangements on the Enron balance sheet. And so what they were managing to do is divert actual expenditure, which in fact should have shown that the business was in trouble, and they were holding it back in the balance sheet and it was not hitting the P&L. And therefore, Enron artificially built up the stock price, and Mr. Skilling eventually went to jail for all of that. But the financial community of the world said, can't allow people to take expenses which should truly be expensed and hide it on the balance sheet. And so, therefore, even when people were having intangible assets like brands, like goodwill and things like that, if in fact they'd over-invested in the brands and they were obliged to impair the brand because they'd spent too much money on the brand, as many companies have in the past, then the companies have to charge that impairment to the P&L. And in the old days, what used to happen, they used to be able to charge that as an intangible asset below the net profit line. They considered it as an appropriation of profits. But then the accounting fraternity said, no, that's not right. You actually got to put everything into the P&L above the net profit line. And so some terms got coined like headline earnings per share and unadjusted earnings per share and things like that. Because companies knew, or they know, we've got to try and distinguish between what's the normal trading operations and all of this impairment of assets. So we can't take a GAIA project and we can't even treat it as an intangible asset. It doesn't fit. It just doesn't within the rules, within the IFRS rules, within the American GAAP rules. It does not allow you to take money that you've invested in the planet, and it doesn't matter how you invest that money, in what you invested. It doesn't matter what that investment might be. It doesn't matter if it's something that's of the nature of something where you don't own the asset. Well, I'm sorry, that's going to hit your P&L, it's going to screw your share price, and you'll lose your job.
What would your plea be to the SEC, I guess?
My plea would be create the concept of a GAIA asset. Change the rules with regard to the way the asset is done and the whole impairment stuff, and acknowledge that provided it is an approved GAIA asset. Now, obviously, there's got to be control on it. So, I don't know, Greenpeace or United Nations or the SEC themselves or something would have to agree that the project that you're investing on is a valid GAIA asset. Then, and what might that be? Well, the best of all, perhaps, would be to invest in one of the 9 planetary boundaries. Now, many people might not know of the planetary boundaries. This is the research that's done by Johan Rookström and his colleagues in Sweden, where they've discovered that there are 9 items or elements that if we in fact exceed X number of those, we don't know how many, but if we exceed 3, 4, 5, 6 of the 9, at some point in time, the weight on Mother Earth is going to be so bad that it's going to go and we'll all disappear. And Charles Dickens wrote many years ago, he wrote the simple concept from Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield. And he wrote, Mr. Micawber said, income £20, expenditure £19, 19 and 6 pence. Result happiness. Income £20, expenditure £20 and 6 pence. Result misery. And that is really free cash flow. He was talking about free cash flow. And what we need is just enough cash, Microsoft, to cover what it needs and keep things going. And all of that rest of Microsoft's $100 billion. If Microsoft took $100 billion today and shared it out over the 9 planetary boundaries and got hold of the Greenpeace people and got hold of the people that are driving this forward and said, right, let's make a difference to the world. If it was added to their assets, they would in fact change the world.
It's a powerful pledge.
Absolutely. And we can help to make sure that every one of your people understand it.